The city stated wieder the night slipped past midnight. Casino door spinning like timed its matter on a moor. Inside one of the largest hotels on the strip, the maintenance of walkers move through back corridors, the cameras body where had service elevators, access tunnels, the floor waiting for innovation. Tire radios crackled with routine check-ins. 10 went quiet. No alarms, no shooting, no sudden chaos. Just a slow dropout from the hotel systems, like they were never meant to be visible in the first place. Morning arrived. Goose lined up for breakfast, and the building kept earning money while the name stayed unchecked on the clock outside.
The city was still awake when the night began to forget itself. Las Vegas is a way of blurring time, of convincing everyone inside it that hours don't move forward so much as circle endlessly. Neon replaces the sun. Artificial dawns arrive every few minutes through revolving doors. Somewhere between the clatter of slot machines and the low murmur of exhausted laughter, entire nights dissolve without consequence. This one should have been no different. It was not a holiday, not a headline night, just another weekday slipping quietly toward morning beneath the glow of casino lights. Inside one of the Strip's largest hotels, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale carpet. Guests drifted to the lobby with plastic smiles and paper cups, chasing luck that never promised to stay. Above them, unseen, floors were being prepared for future renovation. Walls were being measured, corridors inspected. The hotel was shedding an old skin, one hidden layer at a time. 3 crew members were nearing the end of their shift. They weren't gamblers. They weren't tourists. They didn't belong to the version of Las Vegas most people came to see. Their world existed behind the polished surfaces. Service elevators, maintenance tunnels, access doors marked staff only. Places where the lights were harsher and the silence heavier. Places that didn't care about spectacle. The clock crept past midnight. Radios crackled softly. Paperwork waited to be finished. The work was routine, almost dull, the kind that encourages your mind to wander just enough to forget how tired you are. None of them had any reason to believe this night would be remembered. None of them left messages behind or said anything that sounded like goodbye. They simply kept working, moving deeper into the building that paid them to remain invisible. Las Vegas did not notice. Outside, the Strip pulsed with confidence. Taxis lined up like obedient insects. Music spilled from open doors and collided in the street, creating a sound that felt alive, even hopeful. The city projected permanence, a sense that nothing truly bad could happen here, because everything was replaceable. Buildings were replaced. Names were replaced. Even people eventually were replaced. The city had survived mob wars, financial collapses, fires, demolitions. It would survive this night, too. Inside the hotel, the hours thinned. There is particular quiet that settles in large buildings after midnight, even in places designed never to sleep. It's not silence exactly, but a softening. The echo of footsteps lingers longer. Mechanical sound become more noticeable. The hum of ventilation, the distant groan of elevators resetting themselves. It's during these hours that buildings feel less like places and more like things, enormous structures doing what they were built to do without acknowledging who happens to be inside them. Somewhere on an upper floor, a corridor remained sealed to guests. It had been closed for months, maybe years, its purpose slowly eroding in memory. The signage was outdated. The blueprints conflicted with each other. A door that once led somewhere meaningful now led into uncertainty. In Vegas, uncertainty is rarely confronted. It is covered over, redirected, disguised. The crew had access where others did not. They moved through spaces that no camera watched closely, spaces that existed in blind spots by design. Casinos invest millions into surveillance, but not all areas are equal. The glittering heart of the building, the gaming floor, the cash cages, the entrances, was watched relentlessly. The skeleton of the hotel, however, was left largely to trust. Trust that workers would come and go. Trust that nothing important would happen there. Trust, in this case, would prove expensive. As the night deepened, records grew thin. Logs were incomplete. Time stamps blurred. What could be confirmed later would feel insufficient, like trying to reconstruct a dream from a single image. At some point, radio communication stopped. At some point, The three men were last seen heading in a direction no guest would ever follow. Then the night ended. Morning arrived with indifference. The strip dimmed itself reluctantly. Housekeeping carts rolled out. Breakfast buffets filled with people who slept poorly and pretended otherwise. Shift changes happened. Clipboards were checked. Names were scanned, then scanned again. It took longer than anyone would later admit before someone noticed that 3 crew members had not clocked out. At first, there was no panic. In a city built on transients, absence is rarely alarming. Workers quit without notice. People walk away. People get fired and disappear. Management assumed a mistake, a scheduling mix-up, a clerical error that would correct itself by lunch. It didn't. Phones went unanswered. Homes were empty. Families woke to a silence that felt wrong before it felt frightening. Somewhere between the first missed call and the last unanswered voicemail, concern hardened into something heavier. 3 men had gone to work in one of the most heavily trafficked buildings in America. They did not come home. No alarms had sounded. No evacuation occurred. Guests continued checking in and out. Unaware, they were sleeping above a question no one yet knew how to ask. The hotel continued to generate profit, continued to function exactly as intended. From the outside, nothing had changed. That was the most unsettling part. Las Vegas is a city that thrives on excess, on the idea that everything is bigger, louder, more visible than anywhere else. Yet on this night, something profoundly quiet happened. 3 lives slipped out of view without resistance. No violence announced itself. No dramatic confrontation demanded attention. Just a slow erasure, absorbed seamlessly into the city's rhythm. And perhaps that is why this story would take years to surface. Because mysteries that explode demand answers. Mysteries that whisper are easier to bury. In the days that followed, the hotel would insist it had done nothing wrong. Records would be reviewed. Statements would be made. And behind every reassurance lingered the same unspoken truth. Buildings like this are designed to keep guests comfortable, not to keep workers safe. Walls were thick. Corridors were layered. And somewhere inside that vast structure, something had gone wrong quietly enough that the city did not feel the need to stop. Las Vegas had seen countless nights vanish without consequence. This one just happened to take 3 people with it. They were the kind of people whose names were rarely spoken by guests, whose faces blended into the background of the city, trained not to look too closely at the hands that kept it running. Each of the 3 men arrived at the hotel the same way thousands of workers did every day, through entrances designed to be functional rather than impressive. No fountains, no music, just key cards, narrow hallways, and fluorescent lights that hummed with quiet impatience. Their shifts began long before the city's mood shifted into night, and often ended long after it had forgotten what morning felt like. They were crew members, but that word barely captured what they did. They were problem solvers in a building that aged faster than it admitted. They fixed what guests never noticed until it stopped working. Loose panels, faulty wiring, doors that didn't close the way they used to. They moved between floors like ghosts, aware of the hotel's anatomy in ways most people never would be. One of them had been there the longest. He knew the building not just as it was, but as it had been, before the last renovation, before the rebranding, before entire sections were quietly closed and absorbed into something newer and more profitable. He carried that knowledge casually, the way long-term workers do, pointing out changes to newer hires, warning them about elevators that stalled or corridors that led nowhere useful anymore. Another was newer, still learning which hallways mattered and which ones were best avoided because they led to nothing but confusion and paperwork. He worked hard, eager to prove himself reliable in a city where jobs disappeared as quickly as they appeared. He had plans outside the hotel, a life that existed beyond the service doors. But for now, the job mattered. The paycheck mattered. Stability mattered. The third was somewhere in between, experienced enough to know the rhythms of overnight work, but still careful, still attentive. He understood that night shifts changed people, that fatigue crept in quietly and made mistakes easier. He double-checked his tasks. He kept his radio close. He liked knowing where he was at all times inside the building, as if orientation itself offered protection. None of them were reckless. None of them were looking for trouble. They weren't chasing rumors or testing boundaries for the thrill of it. They were there to work, to complete assigned tasks, to go home. What connected them wasn't just their schedule or their job title. It was their relationship to invisibility. Guests passed them without a glance. Management noticed them only when something went wrong. Security cameras rarely lingered on them. They existed in a category of people the city depended on, but rarely acknowledged. In Las Vegas, attention is currency. And these men worked in places where attention had no value. Their days blurred into nights. Their nights blurred into something quieter. They learned to measure time by shift changes and meal breaks grabbed in silence. They learned which corners of the building felt colder, which stairwells echoed too loudly, which doors opened into spaces that felt forgotten. Those forgotten spaces were becoming more common. The hotel was preparing for another renovation, another attempt to stay relevant in a city that punished stagnation. New attractions were planned. Old sections were being phased out. Temporary walls were installed with the promise they'd be removed later. Some were, some weren't. Over time, the building accumulated layers, physical reminders of decisions made quickly, sometimes carelessly. The crew worked among those layers. They knew about the sealed floors, the blocked corridors that once connected to something meaningful. They joked about them sometimes, calling them dead zones or lost hallways. But beneath the humor was an understanding that these areas weren't meant for guests, weren't meant to be seen. They were mistakes the hotel preferred to forget, and forgetting came easily here. Outside the service corridors, Las Vegas thrived on reinvention. Inside them, history piled up quietly. Old wiring coiled behind new drywall. Abandoned storage rooms collected dust. Signage pointed to places that no longer existed. If you didn't know what you were looking for, you could wander in circles without realizing it. The men navigated these spaces with familiarity. But familiarity can breed a dangerous kind of comfort. When you walk the same halls every night, they begin to feel predictable, safe. You stop questioning why a door is locked or why a corridor suddenly narrows. You assume there's a reason, and that the reason isn't your concern. Each of them carried private worries at night, the kind people carry silently into work. Bills, family expectations, fatigue that settled into the bones. None of those worries felt urgent enough to slow them down. None felt like warnings. They checked in with each other casually, the way co-workers do when they share long hours. Short conversations, dry humor, complaints about management. Nothing memorable. Nothing that would later sound ominous when repeated. If anyone had asked them that evening how they felt, they would have answered honestly and unremarkably. Tired, ready to finish the shift, thinking about home. That ordinariness is what made their disappearance so difficult to accept later. There were no signs of conflict between them, no record of disciplinary issues, no indication they planned to leave their jobs. They had shown up because that's what they always did. Reliability was their defining trait. It was what made them valuable and, paradoxically, easy to overlook. As the hours passed, their work took them deeper into parts of the hotel most people never saw. Spaces where the air felt different, heavier, where lighting was temporary and shadows gathered in corners. They had been there before, but something about the night stretched those spaces, made distances feel longer. In buildings this large, direction can become an illusion. One wrong turn doesn't feel dangerous until it compounds into several. A left where there should have been a right. A door that locks behind you without explanation. The hotel was not malicious, but it was indifferent, and indifference can be just as unforgiving. Still, there was no moment where any of them realized something was wrong. At least, no moment that survived in any record. If unease crept in, it went undocumented. If confusion arose, it didn't reach anyone who could help. They trusted the building because they had to. Trust was part of the job. Later, investigators would search for clues in their personal lives, hoping to find something that explained why 3 men might vanish willingly. They would find nothing that fit. No sudden withdrawals. No packed bags. No confessions hidden in notebooks. Just unfinished plans and routines that ended abruptly. Their invisibility had followed them home. When the hotel finally acknowledged they were missing, their absence felt abstract, like a scheduling problem rather than a human crisis. But for those who knew them, the absence was immediate and physical. A chair left empty, a phone that didn't ring, a silence that grew heavier with each unanswered call. These were men who lived in the margins of the city, obsessed with center stage. Men whose work was meant to erase problems before anyone noticed them. And now they themselves had become a problem no one seemed eager to notice. The irony lingered quietly, embedded in the walls they once walked past without question. They had spent their nights maintaining a structure designed to hide its flaws. And somehow, without spectacle or warning, the structure had hidden them too. The hotel had not been built all at once. That was the first thing anyone who studied it closely would learn. It was assembled in chapters, each responding to a different era of Las Vegas ambition. What began as a single, confident structure had expanded outward and upward, absorbing neighboring properties, demolishing what no longer fit, and sealing off what proved too inconvenient to remove. Over decades, it became less a building and more a collection of decisions layered on top of one another. From the outside, it looked seamless. Glass, steel, and signage worked together to project confidence and cohesion. Guests arriving at the entrance saw only what they were meant to see: symmetry, luxury, order. Inside, the illusion held, at least in public spaces. Corridors flowed naturally. Elevators arrived on cue. Lighting guided people gently where they were supposed to go. But behind that choreography existed a different reality. Hotels like this one grow the way cities do, unevenly, impulsively, sometimes carelessly. Renovations promise improvement, but often deliver compromise. A hallway is shortened to make room for a new attraction. A staircase is removed because it no longer aligns with updated fire codes. Temporary walls become permanent because removing them costs more than leaving them in place. Over time, intent gives way to convenience. The result is a structure with memory problems. Blueprints told one story. Reality told another. Maps contradicted each other, depending on which year they were printed. Some plans showed entire sections that no longer existed. Others failed to acknowledge additions that had been in place for years. For architects and inspectors, these inconsistencies were frustrating. For maintenance crews, they were simply part of the job. The hotel had places that were officially closed, though few could say precisely when or why. Some floors were sealed during renovations and never reopened. Others were repurposed quietly, stripped of guest access and handed over to storage or infrastructure. Over time, these areas fell out of conversation. People stopped asking about them. New staff were never told they existed. Walls became solutions. If a space no longer served a purpose, it was easier to enclose it than to explain it. Drywall went up. Doors were removed or locked permanently. Signage was taken down. And with each sealed section, the building became more efficient on the surface and more confusing underneath. There were corridors that narrowed unexpectedly, forcing you to walk single file. There were ceilings lower than the rest, heavy with exposed piping and electrical lines that hummed softly at night. There were stairwells that ended one floor shorter where they should have gone. None of it was dangerous by itself. But together, it created a sense of disorientation that crept up on you slowly. People who worked there long enough developed a kind of internal compass. They learned to recognize subtle shifts in temperature that meant you were moving away from guest areas. They learned that certain turns should never be taken unless you had a reason. They learned which doors closed automatically behind you and which didn't. Still, even the most experienced workers admitted there were parts of the hotel they avoided, not because they were afraid, exactly, but because they felt unnecessary, forgotten, as if the building itself had moved on and left those spaces behind. In a city obsessed with the future, the past was something to be buried rather than confronted. Renovations intensified this tendency. Each new project promised transformation, new themes, new attractions, new revenue streams. Contractors came and went. Temporary structures multiplied. Schedules tightened. Corners were cut. When deadlines loomed, clarity became optional. During one major renovation phase, entire floors were stripped down to their frames. Walls were removed, then replaced differently. Pathways shifted. What had once been a straight corridor became a sequence of turns. Access points changed, but not always in ways that were documented thoroughly. What mattered was that guests never saw the mess. The crew members understood this instinctively. They worked in the margins of change, navigating spaces that were constantly in flux. One week a hallway was accessible. The next, it was blocked with no explanation beyond a handwritten sign taped to the wall. These changes were treated as temporary even when they lasted for years. The hotel relied on the assumption that no one would linger long enough to notice. At night, especially, the building felt different. Without the constant flow of guests, the structure revealed its inconsistencies. Sounds traveled farther. Airflow shifted. The hum of machinery became more pronounced, echoing through shafts and ducts that connected areas no one remembered building. There were rooms that had no clear purpose anymore. Storage spaces filled with outdated furniture and unused fixtures. Offices that once belonged to departments that no longer existed. In some cases, these rooms were sealed entirely, their entrances disguised behind walls or panels that blended into their surroundings. From a business perspective, this made sense. From a human one, it created blind spots. Security coverage reflected the same priorities. Cameras were placed where money moved, where guests gathered, where incidents would be most visible. Service corridors were monitored less consistently. Temporary areas even less so. Some spaces weren't covered at all, either because they were considered low risk or because no one realized they still existed. The building trusted itself to contain whatever happened inside it. That trust extended the assumption that anyone working within those walls knew how to get out. That orientation was automatic. That experience equaled safety. But experience only helps when the environment follows predictable rules, and this hotel no longer did. There were stories, quietly shared among workers, about getting turned around during overnight shifts, about emerging from stairwells into unfamiliar sections, about doors that didn't appear on any map. By the time the shift moved past midnight, the hotel had settled into its quieter rhythm, the kind that only people who work through the night ever truly recognize. The bright, performative energy of the evening had softened into something mechanical. Guests still wandered the casino floor, but fewer of them noticed anything beyond a glow in front of their faces. This was when the building belonged less to spectacle and more to systems. The 3 crew members had already been working for hours. Fatigue sat lightly on their shoulders, not heavy enough to be dangerous, just enough to make the minutes feel longer. Their tasks were ordinary, the kind that rarely left a paper trail worth revisiting. Inspect this corridor. Check that panel. Confirm access to a section scheduled for future renovation. None of it suggested risk. Their radios crackled intermittently. Short bursts of communication that barely interrupted the silence. A confirmation here. A casual remark there. The kind of talk that exists only to prove someone is still on the other end. Nothing in those exchanges would later sound alarming. No raised voices. No urgency. At some point, the work pulled them away from the areas most familiar to them and into sections of the building that existed somewhere between use and abandonment. These were not guest-facing spaces. They were transitional zones, areas in flux. The lighting was inconsistent. Some fixtures were new and harsh. Others flickered slightly, a reminder that the renovation was still incomplete. They moved with professional ease, stepping around construction materials and temporary barriers that had been in place long enough to feel permanent. Handwritten signs pointed vaguely toward alternate routes. Doors were labeled with outdated information. It was a kind of environment that demanded attention without offering clarity. The timeline of what happened next would later be reconstructed from fragments. Security logs, access card records, testimonies from co-workers who thought they had seen something but weren't sure anymore. Each piece existed on its own, incomplete and slightly unreliable. There was a moment, small, easily overlooked, when one of them radioed in about an unexpected access issue. Not a complaint, just an observation. A door that should have been open wasn't, or perhaps one that shouldn't have been accessible was. The response, if it came at all, was routine. Check it when you can. Note it for later. Nothing in the exchange elevated the situation beyond inconvenience. In a building this size, inconvenience was constant. They adjusted their route, moving around the obstruction. This took them further into the service network, into corridors that narrowed and ceilings that dipped lower. The air felt cooler there, less circulated. Their footsteps sounded different, absorbed rather than echoed. Time behaved strangely in these spaces. Without windows or consistent reference points, minutes stretched unpredictably. The men relied on habit and internal clocks more than any visible marker. When your job teaches you that everything eventually connects back to something familiar, you stop questioning where you are, at least at first. Another radio check-in happened later, brief and unremarkable. Someone acknowledged it. Someone didn't. The record wasn't clear. What was clear was that communication became less consistent as the night went on. Whether due to signal interference or simple distraction, the effect was the same. The thread connecting them to the rest of the building began to fray. They continued working, trusting that the route would loop back toward a known access point. It usually did. But this time, the environment offered subtle resistance. A locked door where there shouldn't have been one. A hallway that seemed longer than remembered. A junction that forced a decision between two equally unfamiliar paths. None of this would have felt dramatic in the moment. Confusion in service areas was common. You recalibrated. You backtracked. You laughed about it later. Except backtracking doesn't always work when doors close automatically behind you. Somewhere during this sequence, they crossed into a part of the building that had been sealed off more completely than the others. The kind of space created not by deliberate design, but by accumulation. Walls added on top of walls. Access points removed without clear documentation. A section that existed physically, but not administratively. The lighting there was minimal. Enough to see, not enough to orient yourself. The hum of machinery was louder, closer, vibrating through surfaces in a way that made it hard to tell direction by sound. Radios crackled, then fell silent. Whether they realized something was wrong is impossible to know. There was no surviving record of panic. No call for help that made it through. If fear arrived, it did so quietly, filtered through professionalism and disbelief. People rarely jump straight to worst-case scenarios, especially in familiar environments. They likely assumed the issue was temporary. A door would open. A signal would return. Someone would answer. The building, however, offered no urgency in response. As minutes passed, the absence of communication would have begun to register. The silence on the radio would feel heavier than before. Not alarming yet, but uncomfortable. The kind that encourages you to check settings. Adjust your grip. Try again. If they tried, no one heard them. The space they were in did not welcome sound. Walls absorbed it. Corridors bent it. Machinery drowned out. The hotel continued to function elsewhere, blissfully unaware of the small crisis unfolding inside its unused spaces. Fatigue complicates decision-making. So does confidence. The belief that you know where you are can delay the realization that you don't. They may have tried to find a familiar landmark, a sign, a stairwell, something that confirmed orientation. Instead, the environment offered repetition. Similar walls, similar doors, similar dim lighting. Without obvious markers, progress becomes guesswork. At some point, hope likely shifted into uncertainty. The shift was subtle, internal. Morning arrived without ceremony, the way it always did in Las Vegas, slipping quietly between artificial nights rather than announcing itself with light. The Strip dimmed its glare just enough to suggest rest, though nothing truly stopped. Guests stumbled out of elevators, clutching coffee cups and regrets. Housekeeping carts rolled into motion. The city adjusted its mask and continued performing. Inside the hotel, systems reset. Shifts changed. Clipboards were passed from one set of hands to another. On paper, everything appeared normal. At first, no one noticed the absence. Overnight crews were accustomed to irregularities. People ran late. Radios went missing. Clockouts were forgotten and corrected later. The assumption was always that there was an explanation, and explanations were easier to accept than questions. The three men were expected to reappear with apologies or paperwork. They usually did. When they didn't, the gap was still interpreted as administrative rather than alarming. A supervisor marked their names for follow-up. Another assumed a miscommunication between departments. In a building this large, responsibility often diluted itself across layers of management. Phones rang without urgency. The first calls were practical, asking if someone had switched shifts, checking whether the men had been reassigned. When those calls went unanswered, irritation crept in, not fear. The tone was procedural, almost annoyed. People were busy. There were guests to manage, deadlines to meet. Somewhere outside the hotel, a family member woke expecting a familiar routine to resume. A door opening, footsteps, a tired voice commenting on the night. When that didn't happen, concern surfaced quietly, like a thought you try to dismiss because it feels unreasonable. It was still too early to imagine anything serious. By late morning, the absence began to feel heavier. Management reached out again, this time with more intention. Messages were left. Voicemail stacked up. There were still rational explanations available. Missed calls, oversleeping, personal emergencies. In a city where people often vanish by choice, it felt safer to assume this was one of those cases. Security was informed, but only casually. A note was made, a suggestion to review logs when time allowed. No alarms were triggered. No lockdowns occurred. Guests flowed in and out of the building, unaware that something was beginning to unravel beneath them. The hotel had procedures for missing guests, not missing staff. Surveillance review began slowly, cautiously. Cameras showed the men entering service areas hours earlier, doing exactly what they were supposed to do. Then the footage ended, not abruptly, but inconclusively. They simply stopped appearing on screens. It was unsettling, but not yet frightening. Service corridors were walked. Radios were tested. Maintenance areas were checked, though only those that were easy to access. The assumption remained that the men would be found somewhere obvious, sleeping in a break room, dealing with a personal issue, having stepped out without notifying anyone. When they weren't, frustration grew. Families began calling. The tone of those calls was different, less procedural, more urgent. Voices tightened with worry as explanations grew thin. Management offered reassurance without substance, promising follow-ups that led nowhere. The gap between official calm and personal panic widened. At some point, the word missing entered the conversation. That word changes things. It shifts the emotional weight of a situation, forces people to consider possibilities they would rather avoid. But even then, the response was restrained. Missing did not immediately mean endangered. Not in Las Vegas. Not for adults with no history of instability. Law enforcement was notified, but not urgently. The report was filed. Information was exchanged. Questions were asked that had no clear answers. When were they last seen? What were they working on? Where were they assigned? The answers were vague. The building, which should have offered clarity, offered confusion instead. Maps conflicted. Access records were incomplete. Some areas were listed as inactive, others as temporarily closed. The hotel's internal language, designed for efficiency, made it difficult to determine where people could and couldn't go. Search efforts remained limited in scope. No one believed the men were trapped inside the building. That idea seemed absurd. Hotels were safe. They had exits everywhere. Fire codes existed for a reason. The notion that 3 experienced crew members could simply disappear within its walls felt irrational, almost insulting to the systems in place. So the search focused outward. Did they leave together? Did they walk off the job? Did something happen after their shift ended? Security footage at exits was reviewed more closely. Nothing definitive emerged. No clear images. No coordinated departure. Time passed. With each passing hour, concern hardened into something closer to fear, though it rarely showed itself openly. The hotel remained careful about optics. Public acknowledgement was minimal. No announcements were made. No guests were informed. Silence was easier than speculation. Families felt that silence acutely. They began to press harder, demanding answers that no one could provide. The lack of urgency felt like neglect. The assurances felt hollow. Tension grew between those who wanted to protect the hotel's reputation and those who wanted to know where their loved ones were. Inside the building, life continued uninterrupted. Guests complained about room service. Slot machines chimed. Deals were made. The hotel thrived on the appearance of control, and nothing threatened that appearance more than uncertainty. By the end of the day, it was clear that this was no longer a simple administrative issue. 3 men had vanished, not just from their jobs, but from their lives. Their cars were still parked, their belongings untouched, their routines broken without explanation. Yet the response remained measured, almost hesitant. Part of that hesitation came from disbelief. When law enforcement finally stepped fully into the situation, they did so carefully, as if afraid of disturbing something fragile and undefined. There was no dramatic takeover, no sudden flurry of activity that announced a crisis. Instead, the investigation unfolded slowly, layered with caution and restraint. Missing adults were not unusual in Las Vegas. People came to the city to disappear. That assumption shaped everything that followed. Officers began by collecting what little certainty existed: names, job titles, last known assignments, statements from supervisors who spoke in generalities. Careful not to speculate, security personnel offered logs that felt comprehensive until examined closely. There were gaps, periods where records were missing or unclear, but those gaps were explained as technical limitations, not red flags. Surveillance footage became the backbone of the early inquiry. Hours of recordings were reviewed, mostly showing nothing. The men appeared briefly, moving through service corridors, then vanished from view. Cameras did not follow them into the deeper service network. They weren't designed to. The absence of footage was frustrating, but not suspicious enough on its own to trigger alarm. Investigators asked about access points, who could go where, which doors required key cards, which areas were restricted. The answers shifted depending on who was asked. Some employees insisted certain floors were completely sealed. Others admitted they still had access for maintenance reasons. Documentation failed to resolve the contradictions. Blueprints were requested. What arrived was a mess of revisions, outdated plans, and handwritten annotations that reflected decades of change. Entire sections of the building appeared and disappeared between versions. Some stairwells were shown on paper, but not found physically. Others existed in reality, but not on any map. The building, on paper, was simpler than it truly was. The investigation stalled in these inconsistencies. Searches were conducted, but they were conservative. Investigators focused on accessible areas first, places where a person might reasonably be found. Mechanical rooms, storage spaces, common service corridors. Nothing turned up. No personal belongings. No signs of struggle. The lack of evidence was interpreted as neutrality rather than concern. Time worked against urgency. Days passed, then weeks. With each passing day, the assumption that the men had left voluntarily gained traction. Adults, after all, had the right to walk away. Without proof of foul play, the case remained limited in scope. The city had seen worse and moved on quickly. Families grew louder. They questioned why the search wasn't more aggressive, why sealed areas weren't opened, why the hotel seemed to dictate the pace of the investigation. Their frustration was met with sympathetic language and procedural explanations. There were protocols. There were permissions required. There were safety concerns about entering unstable areas during ongoing renovations. Behind those explanations lingered another reality. The hotel was a powerful entity. It employed thousands. It generated revenue that touched every corner of the city. Cooperation existed, but it was measured. Requests for access were negotiated. Schedules were delayed. Areas were deemed unsafe to search immediately. Each delay felt reasonable on its own. Together, they created inertia. Investigators faced a building that resisted clarity not through hostility, but through complexity. Every door led to another question. Every sealed corridor required approval from multiple departments. The logistics of a full internal search were daunting and expensive. No one wanted to commit to that without stronger justification. And justification was hard to find. There were no distress calls, no witnesses reporting unusual sounds or activity, no clear timeline of when something went wrong. The men had simply faded from record. Rumors began to circulate quietly among staff. Whispers about unusual instructions given that night. about sections of the building that were off limits even to seasoned employees, about prior incidents that had been resolved internally without law enforcement involvement. None of these rumors could be substantiated. None were included in official reports. The investigation remained narrow, almost tentative. Media attention was minimal. A brief mention here, a small article there, without dramatic details. The story failed to capture sustained interest. The hotel's name remained largely absent from headlines. The city preferred it that way. Inside the investigation, focus shifted outward again. Financial records were reviewed. Phone activity was analyzed. Social connections were examined. Investigators searched for signs of intent. Any indication that the men planned to disappear together or individually. They found none. No withdrawals. No travel plans. No messages that hinted at escape or despair. The absence of motive complicated the voluntary disappearance theory, but did not eliminate it. Cases without evidence tend to drift rather than resolve. As months passed, the investigation grew colder. Leads dried up. Attention moved elsewhere. The hotel underwent further renovations, some of which altered interior layouts. Temporary walls were removed and replaced. Access points changed again. Whatever physical traces might have existed were slowly buried beneath progress. Families watched this happen with a sense of helpless disbelief. They attended meetings that yielded no new information. They were advised to remain patient, to understand the challenges, to accept uncertainty. Each conversation felt like an erosion of hope rather than an advance toward truth. Behind closed doors, there was an unspoken understanding that the case might never be solved, not because it lacked importance, but because it lacked momentum. Without a body, without evidence, without public pressure, investigations like this often faded quietly. The hotel continued to operate, its image intact. Guests checked in without knowing they were stepping into a place marked by unanswered questions. Time has a way of loosening tongues, especially when official silence settles in too comfortably. As months turned into years, the disappearance of 3 crew members drifted from active concern into quiet memory. It was no longer something discussed in meetings or noted in logs. It became something remembered only by those who were close enough to the building's unseen spaces to feel uneasy about them. Renovations resumed as planned. Contractors came in waves, each group inheriting only fragments of what the last had left behind. Schedules were tight, budgets tighter. The emphasis was always on speed and presentation. Whatever lay behind the walls was less important than what the walls would eventually show. It was during these renovations that the first whispers began to surface. They didn't sound like accusations or theories at first. They sounded like questions. Casual remarks exchanged during breaks. Offhand comments about odd structural features that didn't match the plans. Someone mentioning that a wall sounded hollow where it shouldn't. Another noting that a corridor felt longer than the blueprint suggested. At first, these observations meant nothing. Every large building has quirks. Every renovation uncovers surprises. Old hotels are especially prone to oddities. That was a rational explanation, and most people accepted it. But the more the comment aligned, the harder they were dismissed as coincidence. Workers started to notice inconsistencies that felt less like accidents and more like omissions. Doors that appeared to have been sealed deliberately rather than naturally phased out. Sections where the drywall looked newer than the surrounding construction, as if it had been added quickly, without the care given to guest-facing areas. In one instance, a contractor recalled cutting into a wall only to find another wall behind it, set several feet back. The space between them was empty, dusty, and oddly clean of debris. It was filled in quickly and not discussed again. The explanation given was structural redundancy, a common practice in older buildings. Still, the image lingered. Another worker spoke quietly about hearing echoes where none should exist, the sound of tools reverberating in a way that suggested open space beyond the visible boundary. When he mentioned it to a supervisor, he was told not to worry about it. Focus on the task at hand. Move on. People learned what kind of questions slowed work down. Stories circulated late at night, when crews took breaks in partially renovated areas. Someone would mention the missing men, usually prefaced with uncertainty. "You ever hear about those guys?" The responses varied. Some nodded, some shook their heads, some changed the subject. The city did not encourage remembrance. What made these whispers different from rumors was their consistency. Different people, different departments, different years, all noticing similar anomalies. Hollow spaces, unmapped corridors, sealed areas that seemed to exist for no practical reason, and always the same unspoken thought. Could someone be in there? No one said out loud at first, saying it felt dangerous, like crossing an invisible line. It suggested negligence. Worse, it suggested complicity. In a city built on optimism and reinvention, looking backward was discouraged. Yet the building itself refused to let the idea rest. As renovations progressed, access to deeper sections increased. Temporary walls came down. Old doors were exposed. Some led nowhere. Others led to spaces that hadn't been opened in years. Workers stepped into these areas cautiously, unsure whether they were supposed to exist at all. In one case, a maintenance worker described finding an old service corridor that had been blocked off so completely it didn't appear on any current map. The lighting inside was outdated. The air was stale. It looked like a place time had abandoned. He left quickly, unsettled, and reported it as a curiosity rather than a concern. No follow-up occurred. The whispers grew quieter but more focused. People stopped talking openly and started choosing who they spoke to carefully. The building had ears, and not all of them were mechanical. Contractors learned which supervisors tolerated questions and which shut them down. There was an unspoken understanding that probing too deeply could cost you work. Meanwhile, the official story remained unchanged. The men were missing. No evidence had been found. The case was unresolved. End of discussion. But unresolved cases have a way of leaving residue. For those who worked inside the building long enough, the residue took the form of discomfort. Certain areas felt heavier. Certain corridors were avoided not because of policy, but because of instinct. People trusted their instincts in places like this. It was how you stayed safe. Occasionally, someone would suggest bringing the whispers to law enforcement. The idea never went far. Without proof, without specifics, it felt pointless. Worse, it felt risky. People had jobs to protect, families to support, and so the building kept its secrets. Years passed. The hotel changed its name. New management took over. The missing men faded further into obscurity. The wall was not supposed to be there. That was the first thing the crew noticed when the renovation reached that section of the building. According to the most recent plans, the space should have opened into a straight service corridor, wide enough for carts and equipment to pass through without obstruction. Instead, the drywall stopped abruptly, flush and unremarkable, painted the same dull color as everything around it. It blended in so well that no one could say how long it had been there without being questioned. At first, no one thought much of it. Renovation work often uncovered discrepancies between plans and reality. Older buildings accumulated these contradictions the way bodies accumulated scars. The assumption was that this was just another workaround from a previous project, something added quickly to solve a problem no one wanted to document. Still, something about it felt deliberate. The wall wasn't aging the same way the surrounding structure was. The materials looked newer, cleaner, less settled. Dust clung to everything else in the area, but this surface felt strangely untouched, as if it had been sealed off and forgotten before time could claim it properly. When the decision was made to remove it, it was treated as routine. No supervisors gathered. No additional safety measures were added beyond the standard. A task was assigned, tools were brought out, and work began without ceremony. The first cut went through easily. Drywall crumbled away, releasing a breath of stale air that carried no strong smell, just the unmistakable sense of long containment. The space beyond was dark, unlit, absorbing the flashlight beams that probed into it. At first glance, it looked empty. Then the beam caught something reflective. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. Just a dull glint from a familiar object, resting where no object should have been. A tool handle. Old, worn, unmistakably human in origin. It lay at an angle, as if dropped and never retrieved. The room fell quiet. No one rushed forward. No one spoke. The silence wasn't fear yet. It was recognition. The shared understanding that what they were seeing did not belong to construction debris or forgotten storage. As more of the wall came down, the space revealed itself slowly, reluctantly. It was not a room in the traditional sense, more like a cavity created by layers of construction. Two walls where there should have been one. A floor that wasn't meant to be walked on. No clear entrance other than the one being forced open now. Inside were more objects, personal items, things that had no reason to be there unless someone had carried them. A jacket, stiff with age. A radio unit, outdated but recognizable. A lunch container, crushed slightly. Its contents long since gone, but its presence impossible to ignore. These were not the belongings of contractors who had wandered in briefly and left. They were traces of occupation. The realization crept in unevenly. Someone stepped back instinctively. Another turned off their tool. The air felt heavier now, charged with meaning no one wanted to articulate yet. The objects sat where they had been left, untouched by time except for dust and decay. There was no sign of violence, no dramatic scene, just stillness. And that stillness was devastating. Work stopped immediately. Supervisors were called, then higher management. Instructions shifted from progress to containment. The area was sealed again, this time intentionally. People were told to step away, to wait, to say nothing. Word spread anyway. It always does. Within hours, the discovery was known among those who were closest to the building's bones. It traveled in whispers, in glances, in the way conversation stopped when someone unfamiliar approached. Details blurred as they passed from person to person, but the core remained intact. Something had been found. When law enforcement arrived, the tone was different from before. The casual distance that had defined the earlier investigation was gone. This was no longer a missing persons case drifting through paperwork. This was physical. This was undeniable. The space was documented carefully. Photographs were taken. Items were cataloged. Each object felt heavier than it should have, burdened by the years it had spent hidden. Investigators moved slowly, aware that they were stepping into a place that had never been meant to be seen again. What struck them most was the absence of chaos. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of fight. Nothing suggested panic or violence. The items lay as if their owners had expected to return, as if they believed, even at the end, that this was temporary. That detail unsettled everyone. The theory that emerged first was accidental entrapment, that the men had entered the space during work, unaware that access would later be sealed, that construction had progressed without realizing anyone was inside, that mistakes had layered themselves into tragedy. It was a theory that made sense, and that was precisely what made it terrifying. If it was true, then no villain existed, no single moment of malice. Just a system that failed quietly, efficiently, without anyone noticing until it was too late. The idea that 3 people could be sealed into a building and forgotten challenged everything the hotel believed about itself, about safety, about oversight, about control. Publicly, details were limited. Statements were careful. Language was restrained. The discovery was framed as unexpected, unfortunate, under investigation. The hotel emphasized cooperation. Authorities emphasized caution. Families were notified privately. For them, the shock was layered. Relief collided with grief. Answers arrived, carrying more pain than comfort. Knowing where something ended did not explain how it was allowed to end that way. Closure felt incomplete, sharp at the edges. The space itself became evidence, then memory, then something no one wanted to dwell on for long. Once documentation was complete, it was sealed again, differently this time, permanently, not to hide what had happened, but to contain it. Renovation plans were adjusted. The layout changed. Once the discovery became impossible to contain, the story fractured into explanations, each competing to make sense of what had been hidden for so long. People needed reasons. They needed a narrative that could be understood, absorbed, and filed away. But the truth, or whatever approximation of it existed, resisted simplicity. The first explanation to take hold was accidental entrapment. It was clean, almost comforting in its logic. 3 men working in a sealed or transitional space. Renovation schedules overlapping without proper communication. A wall erected where access should have remained open. No malicious intent, just a tragic convergence of oversight and timing. Investigators pointed to the absence of violence as support for this idea. The personal items found suggested expectation rather than panic. If the men had believed help was imminent, their calm made sense. They might have assumed someone would notice their absence before conditions worsened. In a building full of people, rescue would feel inevitable. That assumption, if true, was fatal. Critics of this theory argued that it relied too heavily on institutional innocence. For accidental entrapment to occur, multiple safeguards would have had to fail simultaneously. Shift logs, supervisor awareness, safety checks, renovation oversight. It required not just one mistake, but a chain of them all aligning perfectly. Yet chains of mistakes happen all the time. The second explanation leaned toward negligence, not an accident in the purest sense, but a failure to act once warning signs appeared. Perhaps someone noticed an irregularity and dismissed it. Perhaps a report was filed and ignored. Perhaps management prioritized deadlines over thoroughness. This theory was harder to accept publicly because it carried responsibility. Negligence implies that the tragedy was preventable, that someone, somewhere, could have stopped it. It opens a door to accountability, to legal and moral consequences. It suggested that the wall was not just a structural failure, but a symbol of indifference. Those who supported this view pointed to the delayed response when the men first went missing, the reluctance to search sealed areas, the way the investigation remained narrow for so long. They argued that the system's instinct to protect itself had outweighed its duty to protect people. Still, negligence alone did not explain everything. There was another theory, quieter but persistent, that suggested intentional concealment, not in the sense of murder, but in the sense of damage control. The idea that once the men were believed lost inside the building, the choice was made, explicitly or implicitly, to proceed without interruption. This theory was the most uncomfortable. It suggested that knowledge existed somewhere within the system, unspoken but understood, that sealing the space was not a mistake, but decisions shaped by cost, liability, and fear. That silence was maintained not because no one knew, but because knowing created obligations no one wanted to face. There was no direct evidence to support this theory. No document, no recorded conversation, just patterns, delays, the absence of urgency, the way renovations continued as if nothing were wrong. Supporters of this idea argued that institutions do not need conspiracies to behave immorally. They only need incentives. And in a city driven by profit and image, incentives often align with inaction. Another explanation focused less on intent and more on structure. The idea that the building itself, in its complexity and fragmentation, made accountability impossible. That no single person had enough oversight to understand what was happening. That responsibility dissolved as it moved upward. In this view, the tragedy was not caused by a person, but by a system designed to prioritize efficiency over comprehension. When something went wrong, there was no clear path to correction. The hotel functioned as a machine that could absorb loss without triggering alarms. This explanation resonated with those familiar with large organizations. It felt depressingly familiar. As these theories circulated, they were debated in courtrooms, newsrooms, and private conversations. Each gained traction depending on the listener's perspective. Employees leaned toward accident. Families leaned toward negligence. Observers leaned toward systemic failure. No theory satisfied everyone. What united them was a recognition that the truth was likely a combination rather than a single cause. A building that forgot its own layout. A management structure that trusted processes over people. An investigation that moved too cautiously. A culture that discouraged disruption. Together, they formed the conditions for disappearance. The hotel, for its part, maintained a careful stance. It expressed sorrow without assigning blame. It emphasized cooperation and compliance. Settlements were reached quietly. Language was precise. No admission of fault was made. From a legal standpoint, this was prudent. From a human one, it felt hollow. The public response was brief and muted. The story surfaced, shocked, then receded. There were no sustained protests. no sweeping reforms. For the families, time did not move the way it did for everyone else. It didn't flow forward so much as loop endlessly around the same moments, the same questions, the same unfinished thoughts. While the city absorbed the story and moved on, they remained suspended in the aftermath, forced to build lives around an absence that refused to behave like an ending. In the beginning, there was hope, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet belief that answers would come if they waited long enough, that someone would call with new information, that a door would open, literally or figuratively, and explain what had happened in terms that made sense. They replayed the last conversations they'd had, searching for meaning where none had been obvious at the time. Those conversations became sacred. Simple remarks took on new weight. Complaints about work. Plans mentioned casually. The tone of a voice that sounded tired but normal. Nothing stood out, and that was what hurt the most. There had been no warning. No moment they wished they could go back and change. Just a clean break between before and after. As days turned into weeks, hope became conditional. It learned to coexist with dread. Families braced themselves for news even as they prayed for it. Every unknown number triggered a surge of adrenaline. Every knock at the door carried the possibility of finality. When the discovery was finally made, relief and devastation arrived together, inseparable. Knowing where something ended did not explain how it was allowed to end that way. There was no sense of rescue, only retrieval. No reunion, only confirmation. Grief shifted shape. There was anger, sharp and immediate, aimed at systems and people who spoke in careful language. There was guilt, quieter and more corrosive, rooted in the impossibility of intervention. There was confusion that lingered long after official explanations were offered. None of it followed a clean progression. Some days felt manageable. Others felt unbearable without warning. Publicly, the families were handled gently and distantly. Condolences were expressed. Meetings were arranged. Legal processes unfolded behind closed doors. Everything was orderly, measured, respectful. And yet, there was a sense of being managed rather than heard. Settlements were discussed in language stripped of emotion. Numbers were offered where explanations could not be. Signing papers felt like participating in something deeply unnatural, like agreeing to put a price on a life that had already been reduced to an entry in a report. Some accepted quickly, exhausted by the fight. Others resisted, hoping that refusal might force answers. But answers did not come easily, and time wore everyone down. Grief became private. Friends tried to help, then didn't know how. Co-workers returned to routines that felt insulting in their normalcy. The world seemed eager to restore balance by minimizing disruption, while the families lived inside disruption permanently. There were moments when the city itself felt complicit. Las Vegas thrived on illusion, on the idea that nothing beneath the surface mattered as long as the surface remained intact. For the families, that illusion became unbearable. They drove past the hotel sometimes, unable to look away, knowing something was there that the city had decided to forget. The building stood unchanged, its lights still bright. Birthdays passed. Holidays arrived with an empty seat that never filled. Conversations included pauses where a name should have been spoken. The future reorganized itself around what was missing. Decisions were made differently. Plans felt provisional. What made it harder was a lack of a single story to hold on to. If there had been violence, there would have been someone to blame. If there had been clear negligence, there would have been something to fight against. Instead, there was ambiguity, which offered no target and no release. Anger had nowhere to land. Some family members became consumed by questions. They read reports repeatedly. They memorized timelines. They learned architectural terminology they never wanted to know. Understanding became a coping mechanism, a way to feel closer to what had been lost. Others avoided details altogether. Knowing felt like reopening wounds that never closed properly. They chose remembrance over investigation, memory over speculation. There was no right way to grieve, only the way that hurt least on a given day. Over time, public interest dwindled completely. The story was no longer new. It no longer shocked. It became one of many strange things that happened in a city built on strange things. The families learned what it felt like to carry a tragedy no one else was looking at anymore. That loneliness was its own kind of loss. They stopped being contacted for comment. Journalists moved on. The hotel's name changed. New guests slept above the place where the men had last been. Life went on with an efficiency that felt cruel. And yet, the families endured. They kept photos. They told stories to people who never met the men, but needed to know who they were beyond the circumstances of their disappearance. They insisted on humanity where the narrative threatened to reduce everything to process and procedure. In quiet moments, they wondered about the final hours, whether there had been fear, whether there had been hope, whether the men had known they were not forgotten, even when the world acted as if they were. These questions had no answers, but they persisted anyway. Grief does not fade so much as it integrates. It becomes part of the body's rhythm. Some days it recedes enough to allow laughter. Other days it resurfaces unexpectedly, triggered by a sound or a memory that arrives without warning. What never left was a sense of unfinished business. Not legally, not officially, but emotionally. The feeling that something essential had been skipped, overlooked, sealed away too quickly, that the story had ended before it was truly told. For the families, closure was not a moment. It was a myth other people believed in. What they experienced instead was adaptation. The hotel still stands, polished and confident, its exterior reflecting the desert sun by day and the neon glow by night. To anyone passing by, it is indistinguishable from the dozens of others that line the strip. Another promise of escape, another monument to indulgence and reinvention. Time has softened its edges, renamed its spaces, refreshed its identity. Nothing about it suggests memory, but memory does not require permission to exist. Inside, the walls are thicker now. Renovations have smoothed over inconsistencies, straightened corridors, modernized spaces that once felt uncertain. What was once temporary has become permanent. What was once hidden has been buried beneath newer layers of design. The building has been corrected, at least on the surface, as if precision could retroactively erase what happened within it. Guests move through its halls unaware of what once lay just beyond the visible boundary. They roll suitcases across floors that have been replaced. They lean against walls that cover older walls, which cover spaces that no longer exist on any map. They sleep soundly, trusting that the building knows what it is doing. That trust is the most unsettling part, because the hotel did exactly what it was designed to do. It absorbed disruption. It minimized damage. It continued operating. The systems did not break. They adapted, and in that adaptation, something profoundly human was lost without ever triggering an alarm loud enough to stop it. The city, too, has moved on. Las Vegas is not built for reflection. It is built for momentum. New stories replace old ones quickly, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. The city survives by keeping its gaze forward, by refusing to linger on what cannot be undone. In that way, forgetting becomes a form of survival. But forgetting has consequences. The disappearance of 3 men inside a place designed to be safe forces an uncomfortable reckoning. Not with evil, but with indifference. With the way modern environments prioritize flow over awareness, efficiency over comprehension. With how easily people can be reduced to variables in systems that no longer see them clearly. The walls still hold that truth, even if no one speaks of it. They hold it in the way certain spaces feel heavier than others. In the way sound behaves differently in areas that have been sealed and resealed. In the way some corridors seem to lead nowhere, not because they were built that way, but because their purpose has been forgotten. Buildings remember in their own way. They remember every shortcut taken during construction, every decision to cover rather than confront, every moment when convenience outweighed clarity. These memories do not fade. They are simply layered over, waiting. For those who know the story, the hotel is no longer neutral. It becomes a reminder of how fragile certainty really is. How thin the line is between routine and catastrophe. How easily the familiar can become hostile without warning. The men who vanished are no longer headlines. Their names are not widely known, but their absence has reshaped something intangible, a quiet awareness that safety is not guaranteed by size, surveillance, or reputation. It is guaranteed only by attention. Attention is what failed here, not dramatically, not maliciously, but gradually, incrementally, through assumptions and delays and the belief that nothing important could be happening where no one was looking. That belief is powerful. It allows systems to function smoothly. It also allows them to fail silently. What lingers after the story is not fear, but unease, the knowledge that spaces we trust implicitly may contain histories we will never know. That answers can exist without being accessible. That closure is not always possible, and sometimes not even real. The families carry that knowledge differently. For them, the walls are not metaphors. They are boundaries between what is known and what will never be fully understood. They have learned to live with that boundary, even as it continues to ache. The city carries it differently, too. It has folded the story into its vast archive of things that happened and were survived. The hotel remains profitable. The strip remains bright. The rhythm of consumption and distraction continues uninterrupted. And yet, something has changed, even if it cannot be measured. Stories like this alter the texture of trust. They plant questions that resurface unexpectedly. The next time a service door closes behind someone, the next time a renovation hides more than it reveals, the next time a disappearance is explained away as routine, the walls still hold what happened, not as evidence, but as possibility. They remind us that modern spaces are not as transparent as they appear, that complexity can conceal as effectively as intent, that silence, when reinforced by structure and routine, can last for years without being challenged. In the end, the most haunting aspect of the story is not what was found, but what it represents. It represents how easily people can be lost inside systems that believe they are too sophisticated to fail. How disappearance does not always require darkness or distance. Sometimes it happens in the brightest places, surrounded by light and noise and life. And once it happens, it does not announce itself. It waits, behind walls, beneath floors, inside assumptions, waiting for someone to notice that something feels wrong, even if everything appears to be working exactly as intended. Long after the paperwork was filed, long after the renovations were completed, and the story slipped out of public memory, the question remained, not loud enough to demand answers, but persistent enough to refuse disappearance. It lived in the quiet moments, in the pauses between explanations, in the uneasy feeling that something essential had never been addressed. Because endings like this are deceptive. On the surface, everything appeared resolved. The men were found. The space was sealed. The building moved forward. From an administrative perspective, the story had a conclusion. But emotionally, psychologically, it never truly ended. It simply thinned out, stretching across years instead of days, becoming something people carried rather than discussed. For those who encountered the story later, it felt unreal, almost mythic. The idea that people could vanish inside a modern hotel sounded like fiction, a metaphor, an exaggeration. Yet the facts resisted dismissal. This wasn't a remote forest or an abandoned factory. This was a place designed for comfort, visibility, and control. That contradiction is what lingers most. It forces a reevaluation of what safety actually means. We associate danger with isolation, with darkness, with places that feel neglected. We rarely associate it with polished lobbies and carefully managed environments. But this story revealed something deeply unsettling, that danger does not always announce itself through chaos. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wrapped in routine. The men didn't disappear because they broke rules or chased something forbidden. They disappeared because they trusted the structure around them. They trusted that doors would open when they were supposed to, that absences would be noticed, that systems designed to protect would function as intended. Trust, in this case, became a vulnerability. What followed was not a dramatic failure, but a slow one, a failure of noticing, of urgency, of imagination. No one believed something extraordinary could be happening because everything appeared ordinary. That belief delayed action long enough for time to do what walls and silence had already begun. The story does not offer a clear villain, and that, perhaps, is its most uncomfortable truth. There is no single person to blame, no moment where everything clearly went wrong. Instead, there is a series of reasonable decisions that, when combined, created an unreasonable outcome. That pattern is familiar, in modern life. It exists in institutions, in infrastructure, in systems that function well enough to mask their own fragility. This is why the story resonates beyond its setting. It is not really about a hotel, or even about Las Vegas. It is about how people disappear inside processes, how responsibility fragments, how silence becomes normalized, how environments designed to be efficient leave little room for human error, until error becomes catastrophic. The haunting part is not imagining what happened in that hidden space. The haunting part is realizing how easily it could have remained hidden forever if that wall had never been opened, if renovation plans had changed, if budgets had shifted, if one decision had gone differently. The story might never have surfaced at all. The men would have remained missing, their absence explained away by theories that demanded less disruption. That possibility reframes everything. It suggests that truth is often accidental, that discovery is not guaranteed, that some stories only come to light because circumstances align in rare and unpredictable ways, and that many others do not. For the families, this understanding lives quietly alongside grief. They know how close the world came to never knowing anything at all. They know how easily their loved ones could have been reduced to a footnote, a mystery that faded without resolution. That knowledge sharpens loss rather than softening it. They live with the awareness that answers, when they arrive, are not always kind. For everyone else, the story lingers as a caution rather than a conclusion. It invites reflection rather than closure. It asks uncomfortable questions without offering relief. What assumptions do we make about safety? What spaces do we stop seeing because we believe they're controlled? How often do we confuse absence of evidence with evidence of absence? The hotel continues to function, just as buildings everywhere do. It hosts weddings and conferences and vacations. People make memories there without knowing what once unfolded behind its walls. In that way, the story becomes invisible again, absorbed into the background of a city built to distract. But invisibility does not equal erasure. The truth remains embedded, not just in concrete and drywall, but in the awareness of those who have heard the story and cannot quite forget it. It surfaces when walking through service corridors, when seeing temporary walls, when noticing how easily spaces can be closed off and forgotten. It changes how people look at ordinary environments. And perhaps that is the only form of justice this story offers. Not punishment, not redemption, but awareness. An understanding that systems require vigilance, that safety depends on attention, that people should never be so easily absorbed by the places meant to serve them. It is a quiet lesson, easily ignored, but deeply necessary. In the end, the haunting element is not what was found behind the wall. It is the realization that nothing supernatural was required. No darkness beyond human design. No cruelty beyond indifference. Just time, structure, and a belief that nothing important happens where no one is looking. That belief is what must be questioned, because stories like this do not belong solely to the past. They exist wherever complexity replaces clarity, wherever efficiency overrides empathy, wherever silence is mistaken for stability. And as long as that remains true, the walls, everywhere, will continue to hold more than we are willing to see.